The orchestra has grown by the time Beethoven arrives on the scene, so that it is quite usual to have woodwind instruments joining the stringed instruments, and on occasion trumpets and timpani would have appeared by now, both in opera orchestras and in symphony orchestras. So Beethoven carries on the tradition of the first Viennese school of Haydn, Mozart, and Beethoven. And unlike Haydn with his more than 100 symphonies and Mozart with his 40 or so, Beethoven writes 9. And he makes the symphony one of the focal points of his musical art. And the wonderful thing about the 9 symphonies is that each and every one of them tells a different kind of musical story and makes us think about different things. When we come to the 9th, we have to realize that Beethoven had composed the first 8. By 1814, they were all written. And in 1815, he starts sketching something that will turn out to be related to the 9th. And we see in the sketches not only music, but words that connect to the words that come up in the 4th movement of the 9th Symphony, almost a decade later. Not these tones, he writes, not these tones. He's rejecting certain tones. In a way, I feel he's rejecting the first 8 symphonies, along with the tones he's sketching for the 9th, because they didn't quite get the message across that seemed to become so critically important to him, which is music might be the reason for living. Music might be the gateway to heaven. Music is what is soulful, and music is the greatest reward for coping with all the difficulties of life. And surely Beethoven had his share of difficulties. Not only the deafness that was plaguing him since around age 28 were the first signs of deafness, but the difficulties of being alone so much of the time and fighting over custody of his nephew, fighting tooth and nail with his sister-in-law, and being a person who had to move from one apartment to another. So there are a lot of biographical issues. Life is difficult, but music sweetens life. So while some of the earlier symphonies deal with difficulty being overcome, heroism, nature, dance and motion and sunshine and rain, the 9th Symphony ultimately is about how we should live our lives, and what we are capable as human beings of doing with ourselves in our lives. And I have often felt that Beethoven has each of the movements communicate something special about music and about human existence. And the first movement, I think, is about brain. It's a work which is full of tendons and ligaments and sinews, and it's not full of memorable tunes. There's some lack of clarity. It's a puzzle for the listener to get through it and understand where one is and why one is. And I think the second movement is muscular, physical. And I would say it's brawn. If the first is the mind, the second is the body. And when I was a boy, the Chet Huntley and David Brinkley news program on NBC TV used that second movement as its theme music. And I thought, wow, how well this communicates the hustle and bustle of world news. So I think the scherzo is about athleticism. The third movement, which is a gloriously beautiful but deformed double variation movement. And I say deformed because the second theme, which is in a way the even more melodious theme, disappears after its statement and after one variation on it, and then it disappears. And I think there's a reason for that. But both of these themes are lyrical, heartfelt. And so I like to think of the third movement as the heart movement. Feeling, emotion, love. But after brain, brawn, and heart comes soul. And that's the one thing that never dies. It's the one thing that joins that supreme being in the heavens farther away than anyone can see or imagine, which is part of the text of Schiller's poem, the Ode to Joy. The last movement looks back at the earlier ones and says, brain and brawn and love will all evaporate one day, but the soul won't. And if we live our lives by caring about other people and believing in something higher than ourselves, then we ultimately have a hereafter where we will be comfortable and nourished and loved all over again. Now, the pieces in D minor, which Beethoven was very familiar with from pieces like the Mozart D minor concerto and the Don Giovanni overture, it was a key that was full of storm and stress. And for Beethoven, it was a key of his Tempest Sonata. It's a key that creates tension and was used that way throughout Beethoven's era. So what happens in the Ninth Symphony in terms of key is interesting. D major, which will be the key of the last movement's Ode to Joy theme, tries very hard to wrestle with D minor in the earlier movements. And in the first movement, it comes crashing in as the opening of the development section. But it isn't strong enough to stay present for long, and the D minor overcomes the D major. In the second movement, there are also moments in which the major tries to prevail, and the trio section is in C major and also in duple meter, which is very strange for a traditional three-quarter time movement. But the D minor, again, is so strong that the major is turned away. In the third movement, the second theme appears in D major the second time it is played, and it's the first variation of the second theme. And almost because it's in D major, it gets banished. And the other keys remain to the end of the movement, but D major is never allowed to show itself again. So in the last movement, which begins with this cataclysmic dissonance in which chaos seems to be talked about, where we don't have a clear meter, we don't have a clear rhythm, we don't have a clear mode. We don't know if it's major or minor when we hear open fifths. We don't have a clear key. The opening notes are A and E, and you would think it might have something to do with an A key. And we certainly don't have a tune or even a clear subject, not in terms of the 18 teens and 20s. But sooner or later, we get D major as the Ode to Joy, the Freude theme. And once that D major appears in the last movement, it's the D minor that has to be on the defensive. And it's the D minor that has to surrender. And the piece will end after this entire long 4-movement symphony with absolute power and control over things by the D major tonality. The London Philharmonic Society had commissioned Beethoven to write a symphony that was in the early 1820s, as I recall. And he was going to do that, but other things came up, and it didn't ever happen. But he had been thinking about writing another symphony on and off since the mid-teens, and began work again with an idea toward a Berlin premiere for his what would be the Ninth Symphony, and worked on it in 1822 and 3 and 4, and mostly in 23 and 24, and he finished it in 24. And he was really aiming for Berlin when the people who liked him and admired him and loved his music and felt they had the rights to his music in Vienna, where he lived, and where they had been patrons and admirers and audiences of his music. They begged him to have this take place in Vienna. And so on May 7th, I think it was May 7th, 1824, the piece received its premiere in one of the big houses in Vienna. And we know that Beethoven was deaf, and we know that he presided over the performance, but we know that he really wasn't able to conduct it thoroughly. He couldn't really hear what the players were doing. And so he sat near the stage and conducted the best he could. And an assistant or another conductor, whose name I don't remember right now, was the actual conductor. And there are many stories about that opening night, and one of them is that at the end the audience went wild. I guess a standing ovation type of reaction. And the story I have been told often is that the mezzo-soprano, the contralto, Caroline Unger, went over to Beethoven and helped him turn around to face the audience. And only at that point did he see how much that piece had impressed the audience. They were wildly enthusiastic about it. And other performances followed, and the piece has been in the repertoire ever since. It didn't get first performances sometimes for decades in other cities, but it eventually became an iconic work of Western music history and remains so today. The orchestra is a big one, and in the fourth movement especially, there are moments for piccolo and contrabassoon and big rolls for trombones, timpani. He had used these kinds of instruments already in the Fifth Symphony and somewhat in the Sixth Symphony, but the use is really enlarged in the Ninth Symphony. And it's in one of the sections of the last movement where he brings the piccolo and contrabassoon in pretty much at the same point. The last movement is itself a symphony in 4 big units of music, which we can call even 4 movements. So what we always give credit to Liszt for doing, having several movements within one continuous movement, several movements worth of music, and we even give Schubert much credit for that in his Wanderer Fantasy, and we should give Schubert that credit because it's earlier than the first performance of the Ninth. But Beethoven does it really, really well in the Ninth Symphony. You have that introduction I mentioned before, just for the orchestra, the cacophony, followed by the opening measures of the first, second, and third movement themes, all of them rejected by harsh pronouncements from the orchestra. So they are now saying, no, those tones will not cut it. And then finally the voices come in and this cacophony starts again, and the voices stipulate that we're looking for something bigger and better. And finally then the Schiller poetry is introduced through an orchestral theme and variations on the theme that will be used for those words of Freude, joy. And the theme is played with several variations, and it's a beautiful theme which has been used for the Olympic Games and for the European Union's theme, and in many athletic events, for the words, really, joy, beautiful spark of divinity, daughter from Elysium, we enter burning with fervor, heavenly being, your sanctuary. And after the orchestral variations, then the singers come in, and we hear that music again as it is sung. All of that is in a fast tempo, and we can call it a first movement. And then we can have a second movement, which is in 6/8 time, and it's the equivalent of a scherzo. So the second movement of the Ninth Symphony is a scherzo, and the second portion of the fourth movement of the Ninth Symphony is a scherzo as well. It's in 6/8 time. It's marked alla marcia, in the way of a march, in the nature of a march. And the tenor has a solo there. It's the one big solo movement. And it's done with timpani and bass drum and cymbals. And so, knowing works like the Abduction from the Seraglio and Beethoven, by Mozart, and Beethoven's own Ruins of Athens, and works that came later on also, and works that had come in with Gluck earlier, that battery of instruments, the cymbals, the bass drum, and the triangle, isn't it? Yeah. Is used for music that we call in the Turkish style, alla turca, alla turca. There's a Mozart sonata in A major whose last movement is a rondo alla turca. So in that Turkish military style, we have the equivalent of a second movement within the last movement. So following that, as you need and would expect, is a slow movement. And that slow movement is for, again, very special text, meaning be embraced, you millions. This kiss is for the whole world. Brothers above the canopy of stars must dwell a loving Father. So Beethoven brings in the text dealing with God, the all-loving Father, beyond our reach, beyond, in this life, beyond our reach and beyond our vision. And for that he has the third movement, which is slow, meditative, choral, lyrical. And though the note values are very slow so that the listener can't be aware when that movement starts, that it is really another variation, really, of the joy theme music. Sooner or later, when the vast finale of the Fourth Symphony comes, we hear counterpoint between the theme of the joy music and the theme of the slow movement music. And they're both in D major at that point, and they work together extremely well contrapuntally. And we have fugue intimations in the last movement, because very often in finales or in ends of long works that are in many sections, there will be a fugue. That's true for Bach. That's true for Mozart in the Jupiter Symphony. And that's true for Beethoven. But Beethoven's not so strict. He has mostly fugal expositions and not full-fledged fugues. But there is also the complexity of the texture and of the speed of the speed of the tempo working together to make this last section of the Ninth Symphony very, very energetic and very triumphant, very, very triumphant. So that, in a nutshell, is how the structure of the piece goes. What else should we talk about now?
I don't know.
That's a bit.
I don't know.
I have this article, this lecture article.
I don't know how to stop this.
You know how to stop it?
Wait, I see why I have to log in.